I don't want to do any of the remembering today.
No white person gonna brainwash me.
This gallery is in itself a work of art.
I'm surprised at how many people have a car. They won't let their wives drive it.
I sort of realised there aren't any people of colour in those departments.
Women in Australia retire with 35% less super than men, and we're sick of it. The system was never built for us, so Verve Super was. Verve was founded by women to support women to build wealth and invest in a better world, while we all work together for change, because super is power, and women deserve more of both. Verve, proud partner of All About Women 2021.
Warmi, Walama Bamai, Jubagali, Nora Gadigal Mujin, Gurgawiri Galgala Gui, Yaguna, Bariala, Banga Pujari Gunyalung Yalung.
The Sydney Opera House acknowledges the lands of the Gadigal, and we welcome you to Jubagali, now known as Bennelong Point. The Sydney Opera House honours our First Nations by fostering a shared sense of belonging for all Australians. And we pay our deep respects to the Gadigal people, traditional custodians of Jubagali. Welcome to the Sydney Opera House and enjoy the show.
Hello. Oh, it's so lovely to see you. All spaced out, all being COVID safe, and masks on. Good for you, good. So, welcome to All About Women at the Joan Sutherland Theatre at the Sydney Opera House. My name is Fauzia Ibrahim, if you don't know me. I'm a journalist with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. It is lovely to be here. I've always loved being part of the All About Women event. Now, before we get into it, I want to get through a little bit of housekeeping here. Bear with me a little bit. Those of you who are more tech savvy, you probably know how to deal with this. We would love to get your participation, of course, in this talk, because it's not just a talk between me and Koa Beck. We'd love to hear from you as well. So you can always submit your questions. Now, we're doing away with the microphones this year, as you know, just in case you didn't know there was a pandemic going on right now, and lovely masks, by the way. But you can still submit your questions, and we'd love to hear from you. So we'll be using Slido. Now, this is the first time that I'm using Slido as well, so it's the first time for you we're in this together. And Slido will collect your questions for the Q&A portion of the talk. You can just submit your questions at any point during this talk. Now, if you're in this venue today, or you're joining us from home, you can always open your preferred browser, go to sli.do, then type in the event code All About Women. You then select the venue, and right now we're in the Joan Sutherland Theatre, and then you'll be directed to the question submission page. And of course, if you see that there are the same question that you wanted to ask is already there, you can always vote that. And the more that particular question gets more votes, then that question kind of gets higher and higher. So obviously we then get an idea of what you'd like to ask as a collective. So we'd love to hear from you. Every now and then, I will sort of remind you to come and join the conversation and submit your questions. So fantastic. And I think we'll also be getting some information up there as well, just in case you don't know how to submit your questions. So with that, let's get on with this. Now, I have to admit that when I first prepared for this event, and I'm very excited to be talking to Koa about it, I wrote this very verbose, wonderful introduction about where feminism was going, what it means, where it should be going, and how we as a collective can do more about it. But I've decided to throw that out the window because it's been a very exhausting month. I don't know about you, I don't know if you've been following the news, but I think for many women, it's been a very exhausting month. Particularly women who've been victims of sexual assault, domestic abuse, any sort of assault, and you feel that your voice may have been taken away or silenced. You feel you may not have been heard. It would have been very exhausting, very frustrating, very scary. And I sort of feel we need to acknowledge that as a nation, that we are hurting as a nation. It's a nation of women, as a sisterhood. But I also feel, having spoken to many women and interviewed many more women and spoken to my friends, my sister, my peers as well, I feel that it's not just all despair. I feel there's a change. I feel something is in the air. It is changing. Our voices are getting heard. It's getting louder. We are getting through. But this is the time where perhaps we as a collective, as women, can come together and make our voices broader, shall we say, more inclusive, shall we say, more equal, sort of reach across the different aisles that we find ourselves in. And this is where I feel Koa Beck's book really comes in. The title, I know, is a little bit provocative, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But joining this collective movement as women is more than just pressing that like button on social media or wearing your "the future is female" t-shirt. It's a lot more than that. It's bigger than that. It's more inclusive than that. It really means we need to get out of our comfort zone as well. And this is where, as I mentioned, Koa Beck's White Feminism book really comes in. And I feel that Koa's senior roles at Marie Claire at Vogue and Jezebel as well meant that she was in prime position to watch this rise of the fourth feminine wave. And she also noted the commodification of this movement. I mentioned the future as female t-shirts, social media. It's a lot more than that. Now, this book charts the rise of feminism from suffragettes to modern-day influencers. You have to keep in mind that Koa's focus may be more American because that is the experience that she is speaking from. However, there is a lot that we as Australian women can learn from, can relate to, and do much better, particularly, as I mentioned a little earlier, at this juncture in time in Australia. So without further ado, please make welcome Koa Beck. It's lovely to see your sweet, sweet face, Koa.
Thank you, Fauzia, and thank you to All About Women for inviting me to this very illustrious festival. I wish I could be with all of you in person, so maybe next year.
We'll see you next year. We'll keep you to that as well. Koa, let's talk about the title first. Now, when I first was given your book, White Feminism, I have to say the title, I found it very provocative. I found it, why white? What is it? But then it intrigued me so much that I read through it and I realized it's not so much a race issue that you're talking about, it's more capitalism. It's the commodification of feminism. So explain the color issue.
Happily. So I very intentionally decided to frame this book and this history and this concept around the term white feminism. Having said that, I chose to thread through a lot of what in my country, you know, has been in some cases described as white feminism, has also been shorthanded as corporate feminism. Some feminist thinkers that I really look up to say bourgeois feminism. Other people say girl boss feminism. But the reason I really wanted to analyze a lot of this rhetoric and narrative of women's rights as one overarching white feminism is that what binds them together is this aspiration to whiteness. So not necessarily equal rights, you know, because you are, say, like a domestic worker or a low-income woman or, you know, a low-income trans woman. What the rhetoric of a lot of the feminism that I am tracing and that is considered like the default feminism in my country is that you aspire to essentially white privilege. You're not necessarily working towards equal rights for everybody. So what I mean when I say that is that you may very well be, you know, a low income, say like immigrant woman in my country as well as yours. But white feminism asks that, you know, if you want, say, like a decent working wage, you know, as said low income women, in the United States, there's been a lot of back and forth in my country about the $15 minimum wage, for instance. It's not happening. Then in order to, you know, achieve that, white feminism overlooks you. White feminism asks that you not, you know, mobilize, say, for like a minimum wage. It asks that you aspire to be a business leader or like, you know, the head of a very lofty corporation or very senior or very influential, or a business owner, in order to be seen in white feminism. So that is the distinction.
Is there something wrong then to try to aspire to this, as you say, white privilege? I mean, if a lot of women do want to get ahead financially, they want equal pay, you know, they want a better position. So is there something wrong in wanting to aspire to this?
I only think there's something wrong with it if that is the threshold for your feminist consciousness and therefore your feminist organizing. A lot of these, you know, hypothetical women that I'm citing, and there's more granular data about them in my book, they are looking for a structural reality change, as well they should. And the threshold by which, you know, you say you do want to aspire to, say, like start your own business, or, you know, get to the head of a very prestigious company or have like a very senior role. There are a lot of women and non-binary people in my country, and I'm sure yours as well, that need feminism and do contribute a lot to this movement, but don't necessarily want those roles. Again, they're looking for more of a basic standard of living. And so I don't think it comes down to necessarily being good or bad. It's just that if feminism is being defined solely as this very like lean in sort of rhetoric, that is going to overlook many, many women and other marginalized genders that have contributed greatly to feminism and still do. But again, you know, they don't have these middle class goals.
Talk to us about the roots of where this actually comes from, and you cover this in your book yourself. You know, you take us back to the roots of feminism, suffragettes who wanted the same freedoms as their fathers, their uncles, their brothers. They wanted the same sort of privilege that men had, but all at the expense of marginalized groups.
Yeah, very much so. As you said, I trace white feminism as an ideology and a practice to the beginning of what historians in my country call the modern suffrage movement. So after the turn of the century, you know, the sort of character we think of as like the white women with the bobs who like protested and, you know, were force-fed. And when those particular women of that generation got together and were starting to mobilize for the right to vote, specifically the middle to upper class white women set about a strategy that I find still continues very much today when we're talking about, you know, the woman you're supposed to be thinking of when you think of women's rights, in that these particular particular white suffragists from very comfortable middle-class backgrounds, they designed in-house this very homogenized interpretation of who a suffragist was. And their intentions on this were pretty smart in the sense that they were battling, these very sexist understandings of the time, and that still play out today, especially if you're a woman on Twitter, in that, women who spoke publicly before crowds, who had opinions, who perhaps didn't have opinions that their husbands had or their fathers had, these were deviant women. And so, again, these particular suffragists decided that the way to get out ahead of that was to design in-house who the suffragist was and then export her everywhere. Now, the place, once again, that, essentially erased the many other women who were also lobbying for the right to vote. And this includes, in my country, Native women. There were Native suffragists, there were Black suffragists, there were Latina suffragists. And yet, archivally, when you look at promotional materials from that time period, from many suffrage organizations, the suffragist is very white, she is thin, she is middle class or aspiring to be. She's able-bodied. She is definitely heterosexual. She aspires to be a wife and mother. And she is everywhere. She is all over, many of the campaign materials. And then another place that effectively, erased women of color from this movement and messaged to them that, again, they were not welcome in this endeavor, was that these middle to upper class white suffragists partnered with consumerism and power to export, again, the politics of suffrage. So, Macy's, for instance, was deemed the headquarters for suffrage, which is very curious. And, much like now, how we have all these sort of like girl boss desk mugs and, feminist AF t-shirts. And I heard you say earlier, the future is female paraphernalia. That's not new. That is an enduring white feminist strategy in that you are asked to purchase your politics, and the way that you engage in feminist politics is through buying, whether it's like a tote bag or like in my country, we have, at one point we had Elizabeth Arden March On lipstick. Very bizarre, but again, not new. The middle to upper class white suffragists essentially did the same thing. They had votes for women buttons and hats, and there was an official like suffrage blouse that you were encouraged to buy. So it's a very white feminist interpretation of politics.
Okay, so that's how it all started. Why do you think it's endured for this long? Why do you think white feminists, shall we call them, still push for gender equality rather than a broader sort of scope?
I think that one of the reasons, the key reasons that white feminism has endured, again, as a practice and an ideology, is that it doesn't demand that institutions or powerful bodies change very much. A lot of the strategies that have been put forth by white feminists, whether we're talking about now or even 100 years ago, is crafting this very specific skill set that then, is exported to women of all different backgrounds, of different races, of different orientations, to basically excel in the system as is. So if you think of, like, in my book, especially given, my work experience, I cite a lot of, white collar, like, career advice that is very framed as, feminist or feminist in tone or feminist in headline. And yet, a lot of this material that is being put in front of women to get ahead professionally is very singularly focused. You're not asked or encouraged to think about the structure of your company in a way in which it might oppress or discriminate against women. And that's really an enduring facet. And I think that's another reason why companies, to a very large extent, have been very keen to get on board with white feminism, whether we're talking about Macy's 100 years ago, or like in my country, a hypothetical like Chase Bank or, some big corporation, where again, these aren't women who are, say, unionizing. These aren't women who are challenging the structural power. They're trying to ascend within the current framework.
On that point, in terms of structure, in terms of the corporate world, shall we say, I want to read you out these questions that's just come in. This is from Anonymous, who says, I am responsible for the people strategy in my company? How do I approach issues such as representation and equality without having a, quote, white feminist focus?
I would advise two things straight off the bat. So something that I have done in my more senior roles is that I have changed a lot of job descriptions so that they are, inclusive of people who don't necessarily have lofty backgrounds, who haven't had the opportunity to secure, in some cases, what I think is an arbitrary number of years of experience, who don't necessarily have recommendations from like the most elite places. I think narrative that I've often been witness to in my career, and it sounds like this person, probably has as well, is that, you're in these highly corporate sometimes settings where people say, we want more, Black women in leadership. We want more like queer women as heads of this department. And yet the parameters by which you are supposed to hire are basically the same. Yeah. And yet if we're talking about having, women over 50 work in this workplace, if we're talking about having, women from lower middle class to like working class backgrounds, their resumes aren't going to look like the middle to upper class women who are white, who you're probably hiring on the regular. So for instance, something I've done is like I've, struck college education. I've spent a lot of years in digital media, and it's such a fast paced, in some ways like scrappy environment. And so sometimes, people having 8 to 10 years at a very elite publication, that's kind of arbitrary. That's not really necessary. And yet, that has caused tension in places that I have worked in terms of like, that is the standard, right, for who can work there. And yet, I often take the talking point of like, and that's why your entire department is white.
It is. Well, it's homogenous, isn't it? That's the thing. It's bland, vanilla. I want to talk about, you mentioned more Black women in leadership positions, and earlier this year, January 20th, we saw Kamala Harris being sworn in as the first non-white, the first female vice president of the United States. And I think a lot of non-white and women as well applauded this right around the world. She's highly accomplished in her career. She's a mother. She's a wife. Would you say that Harris has subscribed to white feminism to get to where she is?
I don't know. That's unclear to me, at least from where I currently sit. Having said that, I am very interested to see, what she and her colleagues will accomplish, in her tenure in the White House. A question that I keep getting in the United States, especially as I promote this book and this, increased literacy over, racial literacy in feminism, is this sort of expectation for Kamala in terms of, don't you think Kamala will accomplish so much? And I really exercise a lot of caution there, just because a point that I make in my book, especially when we're talking about like structural power, institutions, powerful bodies that oppress people, it's going to take a lot more than one person. Even somebody as accomplished as Kamala, who has all her accolades and background and is clearly a force to be reckoned with, Kamala and other people like her will move into a constellation of power. And when we talk about, hiring, one amazing woman of color to optically change either, an administration or a company or a university, that's really a stunted observation of like power and also what we're up against when we move into these spaces. Because one person will not accomplish entire structural changes. It will take a lot of people, including the very powerful people who hired this person. And an unfortunate place where I feel like this can kind of go astray is that, sometimes people are hired and put in places to remain, sort of like optical presences of diversity. And a thinker that I'm sure you are all very familiar with in your country, who I cite on that, is Sarah Ahmed. She has written about this concept of institutional polishing, which I cite in my book, in terms of, you're hired because, you know, in some instances you are Latina, you have a different quote unquote non-white, you know, perspective. You are openly queer, you are a single mother. And yet when you get there and you try and make changes so that other people like you can move into this powerful body, work in this company, ascend, you are told that, you know, that's not how we do things. That's not why you're here. You actually are in a position in which you are too good at your job. So I think that a better way to think about Kamala as we look ahead at what she could do is that I hope that she is able to work with other people who hear her out on some of the changes that she wants to make. And to that effect, I hope Kamala, you know, moves left on some things. We haven't heard her say, you know, anything in support of, say, like defund the police, you know, in my country. And a number of women of color are waiting.
Yeah. It's still early days yet, so we'll have to wait and see what Kamala actually does. I want to read out another question that's come in. From Sasha, who says, white feminism definitely exists in Sydney. I think white feminism exists everywhere, where women and people of minority genders of colour have been excluded. So what should white feminists do to be more inclusive?
I think a few things. One thing that I think is a good place to start is that when I, you know, sat down to research this book and then to properly write it, a thread I found through history and that, you know, I heard very distinctly echo back to me when I was thinking about, you know, women I've profiled, women I've worked with, you know, women who I've interviewed who I definitely think subscribe to a white feminist ideology, is that they start a lot of their feminist consciousness from a very individualized place. And that is a hallmark of white feminism. You know, what you need as a woman in your workplace, in your home, in your family, in your neighborhood, but your feminism begins and ends with you. And a big distinguishing factor between, say, like white feminist practices and those of, you know, Indigenous people, of queer people, of working class people, of disabled people, has been that they think collectively. They don't think about necessarily, you know, solely what they need in terms of what skill set can I affect so that I can personally overcome patriarchy. These movements that do not follow a white feminist ideology, they think about what everybody needs, and that is reflected in terms of the protesting that they do, the unions they form, the walkouts that they do, you know, for either like overpriced materials or in contemporary examples, sexual harassment. So I think that coming to your feminism from a place of not just what you need, but what the women around you need, and non-binary people, that's a good place to start. And also to start your feminism and gender awareness from, again, a place of basic need. I've said this before on book tour, but I think it bears repeating, especially given some of the questions that I've got. In my own career, a pattern that I've seen play out again and again is that, you know, I will be, say, invited to a festival or a panel or, you know, a conference, and, you know, the agenda is set, the topics are put together, and then at like the 11th hour, you know, one of the planners who I'm in touch with is like, oh, wait a minute, like, we're not intersectional.
Yeah.
And then, you know, one trans woman is invited to the otherwise like entirely straight, cisgendered, heterosexual middle class, you know, sort of like gathering. And, you know, my remedy for that is like, if you just start at a place of basic need. So if you come to feminism with, you know, a consciousness around like obtaining food security, affordable housing, access to clean water, then you don't have to reverse engineer at the end about like, oh, are we intersectional? Did we invite, you know, one woman of color to otherwise like inoculate us against accusations of racism? And that is a big differentiating factor in that, you know, white feminism of now and 100 years ago, it assumes that everybody does have a a standard of basic living, which is why it often starts at like lofty educational opportunities and then like small business and enterprise. And yet for most marginalized genders, I would argue in the world, you know, they don't necessarily want to be this like powerful leader. They literally just want an affordable place to live. They want access to healthcare. They want, you know, criminal justice reform. So I think a good control is both, you know, removing your individual needs from feminist conversations, and then again, starting with basic need.
That's where I find it really interesting, where, you know, if we're moving this conversation from white feminism, shall we say, and the progress of women and talking about gender equality and moving it to basic needs and basic rights, rights to education, rights to healthcare, rights to safe housing, shall we say, then where does feminism actually fall into this? Why not just call it human rights? Because isn't that just basic needs for everybody?
Some people would argue that that's what feminism has always been.
Okay. Koa, I feel compelled that I need to ask this particular question because it speaks to my heart, because and whoever asked it, thank you very much, because as a woman of color and as a woman, I'm feeling this almost every day. So Koa, the question is, do you have advice for women of color who are ascending through their careers and want to use that position for good? I feel both imposter syndrome and guilt. And this is something I think as a woman, an educated woman who's in a position, and a woman of color, I feel that every day. So what advice would you give to us?
I appreciate that question too for a lot of reasons you raised, and to that person who asked, I have felt that as well in a number of roles that I've had, especially in terms of going up against, you know, protocol, in terms of like, this is just how, you know, things are. And I'm, you know, it's just supposed to accept it or, you know, replicate it. I would say, you know, depending on where you work and again, like what is available to you, try and disrupt and challenge these structures where you are. And the thing is, like, this may play in some ways, you know, to the guilt you feel in the imposter syndrome, and that you may not feel necessarily empowered to make these changes. I know, you know, in my own career, that has been something that I've really taken inward in terms of, you know, again, this system and avenue and path was sanctioned in some ways by, you know, white supremacy and by patriarchy. And yet, you know, you as the woman of color who they've, you know, so very graciously let sit at the table and make decisions, you are, you know, wary of rocking the boat. And I think that's a very real sentiment. I would say, especially if, you know, your organization is overwhelmingly white, I would, first of all, I would try and see if there is some unionization or type of like, you know, policy group you can form within your organization so that it's not just you. And that has helped me in my career towards the latter end. I did work with a union, and it was a lot more, I would say, empowering in the sense that, you know, when I was told to my face to, you know, exploit my staff or to, you know, basically have like a new mother come to work or come back to work earlier than, you know, I would definitely deem appropriate. It was great for me to say, you know, okay, I'm going to talk to the union and I'll be right back. So I would encourage you to think in numbers, but also depending on how senior you are, and I do get into this in my book, there is a lot you can get away with, you know, under the terms like subject to manager approval if you are that high up. So in roles that I have had, you know, certain things are just, again, you know, subject to my approval because that's how senior I was. And so in places where I deemed like the company policies to be, you know, very discriminatory towards mothers, very, in some ways, like classist in terms of, you know, who we hired. I would basically use my seniority in what capacity that I could to just say that it's, you know, it's handled. So if it's subject to my approval, and, you know, a woman on my team has just had a baby, and, you know, we don't have a lot of the paid parental leave that you all have. Ours is very, very abysmal. But you know, if I have decided as her manager that she can work from home while tending to her newborn, then that's subject to manager approval. And as long as, you know, the metrics bear out in the way that they do, in a way that's like satisfactory to the company, then what do they care, you know, what managerial tactics, you know, I'm putting in place. And again, like, I think you should always think about these kinds of roles in terms of policies you can put in place for people that you will never meet, especially because as you get more senior, you will be removed from the most junior entry-level people who probably need, you know, someone with your consciousness and awareness for policy the most. And yet how a lot of this corporate structure works is that you will be taken away from them. So I would advocate to put in policy what you can, and then what you can't, you just deal with internally and don't tell your bosses.
You heard it here first. Koa, just on the point of that phrase, the future is female, you argue that it can't be, it shouldn't be, because of the rise in awareness of gender fluidity. Talk to us about that.
Sure. So I, you know, being in a lot of the mainstream publications that I have been in the newsrooms, I was very aware of, you know, when the future is female started to ascend. And I get into my book, you know, the history of actually where that phrasing comes from. It's actually a deeply radical lesbian slogan. And then, you know, how it ended up like on a T-shirt that like a very, you know, famous person would wear, or, you know, that you could buy at a department store. When I think about, you know, broadly what marginalized genders need in terms, again, of like basic need of, you know, access to clean water, healthcare, I look ahead and that future is not solidly female to me. That is a gender fluid future. And unfortunately, I have watched in my lifetime the future is female, which again started out as a very radical saying, be sanitized of a lot of its original meaning, commodified and sold in the way that, you know, white feminism does a lot of things, but also really grossly to affirm a gender binary, in that, you know, anything remotely positive that, you know, someone who identifies as a woman does, it develops this sort of like catch-all phrasing that doesn't really mean anything. And it's a very, I make reference in my book to what I call the cul-de-sac of white feminism, in that you come in and out the same sort of way. You know, you go through the motions of some sort of like gender awareness, but nothing is really exercised or challenged. And I feel like the future is female is another one of those, where it can sound very satiating, it can sound very empowering, and yet what does it even mean? I don't even know what it means anymore. And I wrote a book analyzing it. It just sort of, I think speaks to like this weirdly opaque, like feminist utopia, you know, where everybody like makes a lot of money and like, you know, wears the clothes that they want, I think. And then, you know, like does well in business or whatever. I don't know.
Chapter 11, you do talk about it. You talk about the branding and the commercialization of feminism. And you say sanitizing empowerment away from radical, deeply historic activism was pivotal for fourth wave white feminism because it had to become transactional, something you could buy, obtain, and experience as a product rather than a feeling that rushed in from challenging power. We've seen the T-shirt, we've pressed the like button, but that's not enough.
No, and I will add, though, that, you know, I think that organizing on platforms like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and I'm sure, you know, the many others that are coming, I think that is a very legitimate form of organizing. And I feel like when I, you know, researched this book and went back to look at, you know, how women and marginalized genders organized against all sorts of oppressive structures and also ideologies, the practices were the same. Like, you said something publicly that you were afraid to say because of the personal attacks on you and challenges, and yet you found other people who it had also happened to and who were willing to speak up with you and therefore challenge power. So that, I think, the digital component of this, I'm not one of those people who's like super hand-wringing about social media or thinks that like it's uniformly terrible. I think there's a lot of nuance with social media. And I feel like feminism broadly is exactly that space. I mean, in my country, Black Lives Matter has achieved so much through, again, like hashtagging this movement. But, you know, getting back to your earlier question, I think what's ultimately concerning about the future is female, is that what that is messaging to me is that feminist gains, feminist legislation, feminist policies will create a utopia for people who identify as women. And yet, you know, we're very aware now through a lot of different histories, through a lot of different increased awareness around rights, that women are not the only marginalized gender.
You know, Koa, so far we've talked about what white feminism is, and it is individualistic, it is commercialized. What is a good example then that you would say is a good feminist movement that is from the ground up, that actually looks beyond the gender equality issue?
I would say the very long history of consumer activism in my country, which I get into in the book in great detail, in that you have, you know, generations of women, mostly women of color, although not exclusively, who have worked across class to and race to that point, to effectively challenge, you know, the price of meat. It started in my country, you know, a little over 100 years ago, where essentially some Jewish housewives got together and challenged the price of meat, not because it was raised to, you know, give better wages to the workers or, you know, give them like better healthcare access. It was literally just like a tax. And these women, you know, could not afford it. And it was outrageous to them that meat would go up that amount. And so they got together and decided to not buy it. They boycotted it. And these efforts continued about every generation or so. I track that through like in the 30s and 40s. More women throughout the country had telephones in their house. So meat would go up an arbitrary amount, again, not for the workers. And these women who were tasked with, you know, doing all this domestic labor, making sure their children were fed, literally their families could not afford this meat. And so they would, you know, tear out pages of the phone book and assign them to different women, and they would call, you know, across states. And it worked. And it continued to work through the 70s in my country. And it's a very, it's a piece of women's history that I wasn't, you know, all that familiar with before I started the book. And I think there's a lot of reasoning behind that, you know, why in my education I was not told about these women, specifically because they are Black and brown. They are working class. And again, you know, they're not trying to be Sheryl Sandberg. They're just trying to get a fair price meat for their children and for their families and for themselves as well. And the thing that another aspect that I really value about that movement is, again, women across race and class worked together to achieve this end.
Koa, I want to come back to some questions here, and we've got a few where there's a common thread, and the common thread I can feel here is that I think some people are taking offense to the white part of the white feminists. One of the questions I'm going to read out to you is, how do you address the response to criticism of the concept that white feminism, that is similar to the not all men trope, so instead not all white women?
In my book, I took great measures to go into the history in my country of anti-racist white women in the South. And these were women who, you know, were white. Many of them were born into middle-class privilege. And yet, you know, from the ground up, used a very intentional racial literacy in their understanding of gender. So I think that, you know, this isn't new. I've gotten this before. Unfortunately, it's from people who haven't read the book, which I think is telling. But I think if you have a lot of sensitivity about hearing a term like white feminism, I would argue that my book is definitely for you.
Another question here. There's a lot of talk recently, Koa, just in the last few weeks or so, about consent. Sexual consent, any sort of consent, and particularly amongst schoolgirls, schoolboys, what is all right, what is not all right, the rights of women and how we can impress that on young boys as well. So the question here is, how can we promote more inclusive feminism in schools and educational environments?
I think a place I can answer this, from my own country, and I'm not as fluent, in your educational system, so I think it makes it somewhat, I hesitate to be very prescriptive in speaking about your nation. But in my own country, a conversation that I find myself returning to again and again with myself, and then, sometimes other women that I've worked with, is that, if you look, at a movement like Me Too, for instance, and you have, so many people who have been victimized, either by partners or, people who have managed them. And yet when you trace it back, we don't have in the United States comprehensive sex education. And so there's all this talk about, the movies people watch, the sorts of culture they consume, the music. In my country, it backslides into racism pretty quickly, in terms of attacks on, say, hip hop music. It becomes a very racialized conversation very quickly. Yeah. But I think that, in my own country, a place we have really neglected is, again, comprehensive sex education, in that, we're kind of expecting these grown-ups who live in a very puritanical society in which, we don't have a lot of clean, direct information about sex, to then go into workplaces and then suddenly be imbued with all this sexual literacy about consent, and then, how to actually approach somebody, or, be on dates with somebody who you might work with. Is that inappropriate? And it's we didn't even address this when people were growing up. So I don't know how we can expect them to just be adults. And I say that with respect to, people across the gender spectrum. A lot of sex education in my country has been very fraught, and it swings back and forth depending on, who the president is and what they're willing to okay and what they're not willing to okay. But, even when you consider queer people, and the kind of sex that they have, and how that's not been a part of, my nation's history with sex ed either. So there's a lot that I think that we're behind on, that I think starts with even just acknowledging sex.
That it actually happens. Koa, do you...
Yeah, outside of marriage.
Do you think that this pandemic has perhaps helped people, or helped white feminists or the feminism movement as a whole, to sort of rethink its agenda, to be more inclusive, to be a lot broader in their issues and their aims as well, given that a lot of marginalized groups have been very much affected by this pandemic, economically and in the health arena as well?
I hope so. That has been something that I've held on to since the pandemic has happened, in that in my country especially, a lot of mainstream feminist narratives and discourse have been very individualized, especially if we're talking about labor and domestic labor. A lot of work that, women have been traditionally tasked with, if you look at white feminist rhetoric, of the last 10 years that I've had to cover, there's a lot of, really coded language around, say, outsourcing, which to me, I hear a word like outsourcing, and that really invisibilizes, say, the low-income women who you hire to come into your home and take care of your children, or clean your floors, or do your laundry, or, clean up after you. And yet, that has been the white feminist solution, is outsource, hire. And yet, for all these, feminist conferences and things that I've had to cover throughout the years and attend, I have never been to like one seminar where I sat down and they've said, okay, like how to make sure that your nanny has health care. Never happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
How to make sure that, the cleaning woman you hire gets paid time off. Here's how you secure that. Never. It's very much about like how you get ahead, your own individual success, how to negotiate pay, which are very important, but not necessarily defining feminist punctuation, I would argue. So I'm hoping that, especially in my own country where, we don't have a lot of like structural protections in the way that you do, say around like parents, I'm hoping that the pandemic has really shaken a lot of women and specifically white feminist understanding of labor and the amount of labor it takes to maintain a home, effectively homeschool children if they have any, cook all the food, clean all the floors, make sure the bathroom sinks are clean, so that we can revisit essentially like what feminist gains have been in this country.
Going back to the questions here from the audience, and this one, what are your thoughts on minimum quotas for women in corporate leadership positions?
Broadly, I will say that I think it's a good idea, but the reason you hear hesitancy in my voice when I vocalize that is my next question is, and then to what end? Like, if you have, say, like gender parity on your board, which is a big conversation in my country, then what does that ultimately mean? Are we talking about half women who essentially push forward and approve policies that disempower, disenfranchise, and exploit other women?
Yeah, that's a good point there. Koa, you close the book by saying white feminists will be the one who decide how long we will keep playing to these historical scripts and when we will stop I can't even say that word now, that we are all aligned in the same way under the same power. For the mostly white audience who may be watching this, who may be educated, they're social media savvy, they're relatively economically secure, what do you think they can do to change these scripts?
I think the first thing that they can do, and again, I say this very intentionally, is to know this history. Because, I could sit up here and rattle off, movements I think you should donate to and marches, that you should go to. But unless you know, the history of why, Black women, for instance, have not been a part of, your subscription of feminism, unless you know why queer women perhaps have chosen to align themselves more with other movements than, say, mainstream feminism, all of those gestures come off to me as somewhat empty and also a little, kind of like homework, like make sure you're a good feminist and you support Black Lives Matter. Like what you ultimately need to do is understand these varied experiences across race and class and orientation. And in my country specifically, I feel like the, dominant narrative of white feminism has been very successful at taking us away from each other, in that, white feminism has such very different goals for what gender equality looks like. It has very different strategies that are just not accessible to so many women. And so again, whether it's, your country, my country, I think understanding where so many women are coming from rather than being reactionary or, saying that like men are necessarily the problem. I think you need to think again more structurally. And I think history can help you do that. Patriarchy is a lot more than just, the man who sits across from you on the bus, right? It's an ideology and it's a practice and it's a thing that shapes a lot of policies. It's a thing that shapes a lot of legislation. And you should think about white feminism the same way.
Koa, you talk a lot about unionizing or looking for a union and trying to move the agenda forward as a collective. This question from the audience, as a union delegate or organizer, how can we make our unions more inclusive and use them to win gains for those who are not white men or women?
Well, if your union, you know, from the jump is primarily white, right? That says a lot about either your company, you know, where you work, or, you know, the type of things that you're organizing for. I think, again, you know, much like that analogy I raised earlier about like festivals or conferences or what have you, if, you know, you and your union have sat down and put together some, you know, bargaining units or like some, you know, very specific campaigns that you want to support, some policies that you want to push for in-house, and no people of color are either co-signing them or interested in coming to your union meeting, that says a lot. So I think that, again, much like I said earlier, start at basic need. If you don't have a lot of people of color in your company, why is that? Is it that, you know, you require a certain number of years of experience and therefore they don't apply? Is it that, you know, the entry level salary is so egregiously low that, you know, a person from a more working class background, a person from, you know, a more like disadvantaged background can't make that salary work in the way that, say, like a white person who went to uni and, you know, can have their income subsidized by their parents can make that salary work. Like, there are structural reasons as to why that is. And when you are able to address what those basic needs are, perhaps you can get more people of color in your company and therefore in your union.
I find this next question interesting, and it's from Anonymous. Is it realistic to expect people of color to achieve power, like Kamala or Obama, to move further left? This is despite historical evidence that they won't. I'm just going to add here, many of the times they feel pressured that they can't, Koa, because they're actually working within a structure that's already been set up before them.
Yeah, I mean, in my own, you know, very, very minor version of that, nowhere near Kamala, I know what that's like. I think that ascension measures and sort of what often, you know, powerful people say, you know, from who are of color, you know, have to play to be able to stay in that roles, or, you know, to stay in those companies rather, those are very real parameters and cannot, you know, be ignored. Having said that, you know, again, I don't necessarily believe in looking towards these specific people to be saddled with making all these changes. A better question that I would ask to this person is that, why are we asking people of color to make these structural changes? Where are the white people who are also advocating for these structural changes and perhaps working with these individual people of color?
Koa, we both work in the media, and we know what goes into making a story. We know how to pitch a story in order to make it to the front page, to the top of the bulletin. We know, you know, we're talking about the structure that we have to work within. We know how to make it work, I suppose. But for the audience that may be reading a particular article or watching a particular story, what would you say to watch for in these articles or in, you know, these reports that promotes white feminism?
I have a lot of experience with this. We could have like a whole separate breakout in which I break down for you white feminism in media. Main things to look out for, and I've seen this a lot in my own country and a little bit in the UK as well, and I hope you leave this conference, you know, maybe able to spot check this in your local media. A big thing is, like, you know, you'll see a headline that'll be like, women TK, TK, TK. That's like internal shorthand for like fill in the blank. Like, it actually doesn't even matter what the measure is. And then when you actually read the article, and I'm not saying like the first graph, I'm talking like read the whole thing, you'll realize that women is actually white women.
Right.
And that'll be reflected in, you know, who they quote, who is like cited. And then like maybe they might have like one woman of color down at the end that's like, yeah, I also agree with this, or I've experienced this, just to like inoculate it against accusations of racism. So I would look out for just like generalizations, because it's been my experience, especially when, you know, I've been assigned, say, like what my outlet deems feminist coverage, or, you know, am going to cover, say, like feminist gatherings, you know, across a whole spectrum of things, whether we're talking like private conferences or even like marches to some degree. When women is used as like a broad catch-all, and yet it's really reflected that like who we're actually talking about is like straight women who are white, who come from a middle-class background, who went to college. And that is definitely not all women. And further on that point, a challenge I had when I was doing the archival research for this book is that when I was going back to reporting that was from, say, like the 60s, you know, during what some people call like the second wave feminist movement in my country, I would see reporting from like the New York Times or the Washington Post. And in a very similar way, it would be like, you know, about some policy that, you know, was maybe going to the Senate or something. And then it would say, feminists reacted by, you know, doing blank. And yet, you know, I keep reading, and again, it's like a monolithic term. I'm sitting there, you know, 50 years later thinking like, okay, feminists, who are we talking about? Angela Davis, Gloria Steinem, Stella. Like it's a problem that greatly, you know, predates contemporary media, and yet reveals a lot about people's like racial literacy or like class literacy.
Yeah. It's a great book, Koa. We're just running out of time. I want to give you the last say here. You know, we're talking about the fourth wave feminism. What do you think the fifth wave feminism looks like? Because we're constantly evolving, of course. What do you want it to look like?
Well, first of all, I don't think it'll be a quote-unquote wave at all. I addressed this a little towards the end of my book, and accompanying this book, I was awarded a fellowship to do the research for this book from the Harvard Kennedy School, and per that, I had to write a paper on white feminism that is free to read. It is accessible to anybody, and I get into a little more detail about, you know, waves in that, but essentially, you know, wave is a very, I think, like reductive way of thinking about feminist movements, in that, you know, you're collapsing what is a lot of different movements, approaches, ideologies, ways of thinking about gender into one monolithic narrative. And even like, for instance, you know, the fourth wave, like there's a lot of contention around that term, and for good reason. So I think that, wherever we move from here, I look forward to it not being described as a wave, and also, you know, being very centralized around structural critique, you know, rather than these individual skill sets that, you know, marginalized genders can adapt to, you know, succeed in the patriarchy or succeed in, you know, very systemic racist circumstances. I also hope that feminist conversation, you know, after me, doesn't fixate, you know, so much on necessarily the gender binary. And that's changed a lot in my lifetime already, but especially, you know, I'm a millennial, Gen Z after me, I'm very excited for their feminism. Because most of them, at least based on polling in my own country, you know, they don't even believe in a gender binary. And yet when I look back on so much white feminist organizing in my country, there's been so much debate about, you know, what a woman is, who is a woman, who is not a woman. Especially, you know, now with you're seeing like a lot of, you know, really outspoken radical feminists come out against trans rights. And, you know, that really like biological foundation by which to understand womanhood still exists. And yet, you know, when I think about like a number of queer movements, a number of like indigenous movements that I cite in my book, that's not the issue. The issue is the structure that oppresses marginalized genders. And so in some ways, I'm looking forward to feminism, and again, you know, many movements have done this already that are not white feminist in practice, moving towards a spectrum of gender. And then, you know, analyzing the structures that therefore oppress all of these genders.
Onward, I say, and I think that's where we all say as well. Koa, it is wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for being with us. Please, round of applause for Koa Beck, author of White Feminism.
Thank you so much for having me, Sydney, and I hope I can visit you someday.
We'll see you soon, Koa. Take care and stay safe.
You too. Bye.
And thank you all for coming today as well. I hope you've certainly taken away something from Koa's talk. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.